Hitler's great concern at New Year was to keep the Eastern Front intact. Having been implored by Klug to do so, he gave his reluctant authority to bring back the front to an agreed line, allowing it to be straightened out at the same time. The worst of the difficulties were overcome by rushing in replacements. The railway situation was chaotic. German locomotives were not designed to operate in temperatures of 30 degrees and were to be found on railway tracks almost everywhere, frozen and immobile. Transport Minister Dortmüller presented to Hitler evidence that the problems had been identified and that energetic action had been taken. Hitler later praised the efforts that had been made. At the end of 1941, Hitler had transferred the bulk of Kesselring's Air Fleet II to Sicily and North Africa for a proposed attack on Malta. Kesselring's feasibility study showed that an invasion was possible, although the Italians wanted to wait for the spring. From the beginning of January, Italian and German aircraft kept up an unceasing aerial bombardment of Malta, but when Kesselring asked for a decision at the end of March, the Italians were still unready. Kesselring's other tasks were to support the Africa Corps and escort seaborne supplies across the Mediterranean. These duties made great demands of the air fleet, so that his interest in the important bastion of Malta tended to diminish. Kesselring was the right commander for the Mediterranean. He was a likeable man, a warm-hearted and cheerful optimist with an open manner, and for this reason found all doors open to him, an inestimable benefit in the onerous liaison he had to maintain with the Italians. Kesselring understood the needs of the Africa Corps and did what he could to equip Rommel for his planned thrust into Egypt. For his part, Rommel often made impossible demands, which did not help. Hitler had great confidence in Kesselring, which was not misplaced. The battleships Scharnhorst and Gneisenau and the heavy cruiser Prince Eugen were bottled up at Brest, where they had been for the better part of 1941. There was no possibility of future Atlantic operations, and they were in constant danger from the RAF. Hitler thought they would be more useful for coast defence duties in Norway, where he feared that the British would eventually attempt landings. At the beginning of January, the Kriegsmarine informed him that they proposed to extricate the 3 units through the English Channel. Hitler expressed surprise that they wanted to do it in daylight, but gave his approval nevertheless. The group would sail beneath an extensive air umbrella composed of Galland's fighter force based in northern France. In the evening of 12th of February, the ships slipped their moorings at Brest and headed undetected into the Channel. At about midday on the 13th, they passed through the Dover Strait. The British were taken completely by surprise, and not until they were almost in the North Sea did the German ships come under attack. Scharnhorst and Gneisenau both received slight damage when mined, but neither was seriously delayed. All 3 heavy units reached their intended ports of destination. The RAF lost about 60 aircraft. The Channel Dash was a complete success. Hitler was overjoyed at its manner of execution, and often referred to it later as an example of how complete secrecy contributed to the success of an operation. As January progressed, activity on the Eastern Front began to diminish. Russian attacks seemed easier to beat off, and the German line began to consolidate. Hitler was concentrating on his new operational plan for the summer. He told Jodl that he had in mind an offensive at the southern end of the front, where his objective would be to cut off the supply from the Caucasian oil fields. In the north, Leningrad would be captured and the territorial link with Finland established. All preparations were to be completed by 1st of May. The dismissal of Generaloberst Hoepner gave rise to considerable disquiet. On the 8th of January, at the high point of the crisis in Army Group Centre, Hoepner had reincorporated Materna's XX Army Corps into the 4th Panzer Army without having first obtained authority from Klug's army group and, worse, Hitler. The latter was extremely irate when he found out, and Hoepner received no sympathy whatever. On 9th of January, Klug was obliged to read Hoepner the following text of a Führerbefehl. Generaloberst Hoepner has endangered my authority as Commander-in-Chief of the Wehrmacht and as Head of State of the Greater German Reich. General Oberst Hoeppner is dismissed from the Wehrmacht with all the consequences that implies. Fortunately, Schmundt intervened to prevent the worst. Contrary to what is often stated, there was no court-martial, and Hoeppner took his retirement at the end of June, drawing the usual pension for his grade and continuing to live in army quarters. In this way, Schmundt interpreted in the widest sense Hitler's orders that Hoeppner's family should be cared for, as the anniversary of the seizure of power approached. Hitler contemplated whether he should fulfill the annual engagement of addressing the German people from the Berlin Sportpalast on 30th January. Goebbels pressured him to do so, but Hitler was so involved in his plans for the summer offensive in Russia that not until the last moment, at midday on the 29th, did he board his train for Berlin. He spoke at 5 on the evening of 30th of January. Goebbels made the introduction. It was a skillfully arranged event with an extraordinarily responsive audience, mostly Berlin armaments workers, military nursing sisters and wounded servicemen. Hitler touched on many old themes. The British and the Jews, the arch-enemies, came under immediate fire. He mentioned the three great have-nots, Germany, Italy and Japan, who were in this struggle to win. He drew much enthusiastic applause, which buoyed him up in his planning for the summer. On 31st January he was back at Wolfschanze, and it was there on 7th of February that he discussed with Dr. Todt the armaments production programme. Todt had arrived at Rastenburg in a Heinkel 111 bomber, which he had obtained for his own use at the end of December 1941. It was his intention to fly out in it early next morning. There was a Führerbefehl in effect that all high functionaries were forbidden to fly in any aircraft having less than 3 engines. I explained the order to Todt and banned his flight. He was beside himself with rage and informed me that Hitler's order did not apply to him. That evening, after he had left Hitler's bunker, I was sent for, and Hitler asked me how my encounter with Todt had come about. I explained that I had merely been following his own strict instruction. Subsequently, Hitler gave in to Todt and told me to have the Heinkel serviced for next morning. I also arranged for a check flight. Next morning, shortly before dawn, the flight captain of the Führer Kurierstaffel got me out of bed to inform me that Dr. Todt's aircraft had crashed on takeoff. I dressed and went at once to the airfield, where I saw a great smouldering heap of wreckage. There were no survivors. When Hitler rose, I informed him of the tragedy. He was visibly upset and made no comment for some time. Then he asked if I knew the cause. I did not, but the weather was not good. Sky and snow-covered ground would have merged into a greyish shade in the darkness, leaving no visible horizon, and I hazarded a guess at crew error. The pilot did not have sufficient experience for the conditions. An investigation into the accident was undertaken by the RLM and SS, but the cause was never established. Hitler decided at once to appoint Speer as successor to Todt. Speer came to FHQ directly to receive Hitler's instruction in his new duties. It was obvious to all that a radical change of direction was in the wind, and within a few weeks the first positive signs were evident. Hitler paid Dr. Todt's special honour by delivering personally the obituary in the state ceremony at the Chancellery. He described Todt as a National Socialist from the bottom of his heart, and mentioned as his greatest achievement the construction of the Autobahns. He said that Dr. Todt had never had an enemy, and I believe that in Todt the Third Reich never had a better servant. On 13th February, Speer called a meeting of the heads of the armaments industry and the responsible government offices in Berlin. Amongst these men were some with ideas for hiving off large sections for their own ambitions. Speer had agreed with Hitler beforehand that those interested should be invited to attend at the Chancellery forthwith to hear Hitler's views, and at this second reunion, Hitler spoke of the importance of armaments and of gathering everything into a single hand. With these words, all personal schemes were swept from the table, and Speer was confirmed as the new supremo of Dr. Todt's empire. On 15th February, Hitler addressed senior cadets in the Sportpalast. The great successes of 1941 were the centre point of his speech. Of the difficulties in the East, he left his young listeners in ignorance. In any case, all they wanted was a chance for glory at the front. Of himself he said, "I am proud beyond description that Providence granted me the opportunity to lead you in this inevitable struggle." Goering then referred to the achievements of the first year of war. As Hitler left the platform, there burst forth such applause and jubilation as had seldom been experienced before. On the return journey to East Prussia, Hitler received the report that Singapore had fallen to the Japanese. Whilst praising the Japanese army, he added that, from the Russian side, it would be seen as irresponsible to rejoice too much at Japanese victories. On the whole, March and April were relatively quiet months, and it was assumed that the Soviets either were so depleted that they lacked the strength for a major attack or were planning an onslaught requiring substantial pre-planning. Hitler was calm and level, and devoted most of his energies to discussing armaments with Speer or scheming his summer offensive. He stressed here that the most important aim was to cut off supplies from the Caucasus oil fields. If this could be achieved, the Russians would be reduced to indolence. The purpose of his attack in late spring would be to straighten the front at Kharkov and occupy the Crimea and the fortress of Sevastopol. After this, he would press on at once for Stalingrad and the Caucasus. Schmundt was given the job of setting up a new FHQ in the Ukraine near Vinnitsa so that Hitler could be nearer the front in the summer. Hitler returned to Berlin for Hildegedenktag on 15th March. It was becoming vitally important for him again to influence opinion with his speeches. In this discourse, he described the fierceness of the Russian winter and the enormous difficulties which our soldiers had had to overcome. But he praised the German fighting men, who, despite the violence of the enemy and the severe weather, had helped to keep the front solid. Full of reverence, and this seemed to me to be no empty pathos, he spoke of the fallen, who had not sacrificed their lives for Germany in vain. On 21st March, Hitler gave to Gauleiter Saukel of Thuringia, ignoring Speer's preference for Karl Hanke, Gauleiter of Lower Silesia, the job of organising the armaments workforce. As General Plenipotentiary for Industrial Employment, responsible to the General Plenipotentiary for the 4-year plan, he had extensive powers to seek out, pool, and distribute the workforce throughout the armaments industry. Saukel's principal source was foreign forced labour, mainly workers from the East. What had been originally designed as a cooperative effort for Speer's benefit developed increasingly into a rivalry since Saukel, one of the oldest Gauleiters, knew that Hitler smiled kindly upon him. On 25th March, Fritz Wendel, Messerschmitt's chief test pilot, made the first jet-powered flight in an Me-262. The second flight took place on 18th July. Despite the many modifications which were necessary, the manufacturer could speak justifiably of the enormous significance of this aircraft, but it was not until 1943, after Galland and Steinhoff had flown it and recognised its fantastic superiority, that Messerschmitt was given the go-ahead for mass production. By then, it was too late. March 1942 brought the opening of the British bomber offensive. On the night of the 3rd, the RAF bombed a Paris factory, leaving 800 dead. The next raid occurred on the night of 28th March, when 234 bombers dropped about 300 tons of incendiaries and high explosive on Lübeck. The old city centre was devastated, the aftermath chaotic. 320 civilians were killed. Lübeck was the first German town subjected to carpet bombing. Hitler said that terror must be answered with terror, but would not go so far as to accede to Jeschonek's request to transfer aircraft from east to west, since that was precisely what the British bombing had set out to achieve. He could not, and would not, give in to it. As a reprisal, Luftwaffe bombers based in northern France embarked on a series of attacks on English towns such as Exeter, the so-called Baedeker raids, but lacking numbers, they failed to achieve an appropriate impact. On 5th April, Jodl issued Directive No. 41. This was the culmination of Hitler's concentrated thinking as discussed in detail with Holder and OKW. While he waited with great impatience for the mud roads of southern Russia to dry out, he used the time to rest, re-equip and rearm his divisions. The directive stated that Army Group Centre would remain where it was, and Army Group North would capture Leningrad and establish the land link with the Finns. All available units in the southern sector were to be grouped up, with the objective of taking the oil fields at Maikop and Grozny, and the passes over the Caucasus Mountains. Jodl pinpointed the attack on Voronezh as the principal primary target, after which the operation would be geared to reach Stalingrad itself, and at least subject it to the effects of our heavy artillery, so that it ceases to function as an armaments and communications centre. On 24th April we travelled to Berlin for a Reichstag speech on the 26th. The reason for it was the pending action involving Höppner. A trial of strength was in the offing between Hitler and the Wehrmacht judiciary, who did not want to proceed, with the harshness demanded by Hitler, against either Höppner or any other general who had been deemed out of step during the winter crisis. In a long speech, his last to this forum, Hitler depicted the struggles of the past and outlined his plans for 1942, before delivering to great acclaim a declaration subsequently published in the law journal Reichsgesetzblatt on 27th April under the heading Übermächtigungsgesetz, Law of Supreme Empowerment. There can be no doubt that in the present time of war, when the German people are engaged in a struggle to be or not to be, the Führer must have the right claimed by him to do anything which serves to secure, or contributes to, victory. Therefore, in his capacity as Führer of the nation, Supreme Commander of the Wehrmacht, Head of State and Supreme Holder of Executive Power, as Senior Law Lord and Leader of the Party, he must always be in the position, if necessary, and without being bound by existing law, to impose upon every German, be he ordinary soldier or officer, lower or higher official or judge, leading or serving party functionary, worker or employee, by all appropriate means the duties he has to fulfil, and in default thereof after investigation, but without recourse to so-called well-established rights, to require of him due expiation without the need to first institute those prescriptive procedures befitting his office, rank or position. This decree formally bestowed on Hitler unlimited power. He was no longer bound by the rule of law, and it made many people sit up and take notice for the first time. The masses, however, were content to accept the measure and its consequences without much reflection, seeing such powers vested in the Führer as justified by present circumstances. Those alarmed by the introduction of previous illegalities condemned this new law as an excess without precedent. The increasing British bombing of German cities was a warning of the gradual deterioration in the overall situation. The entire population now formed a front line. Personally, I was amazed at how calmly the people accepted these fearsome air raids. For their part, the British no doubt imagined that civilian morale could be broken in this manner. But the air offensive against civilians and residential districts did not bring them the desired success. Hitler went from Berlin to Obersalzberg and met the Duscher at Schloss Klesheim on the 29th and 30th April. Mussolini was fed a very optimistic picture of affairs. On 1st May, Hitler returned to Wolfschanze to resume plotting the summer offensive. In southern Russia, when the weather had warmed up sufficiently to dry the mud roads, Manstein's 11th Army was the first to roll eastwards for the Crimea. Across the approaches to the Kerch Peninsula, the Russians had excavated an extensive system of trenches. These were broken down by heavy artillery, Stukas and landing craft, to enable the whole Crimea to fall into our hands by 16th of June. A second operation by Army Group South to clear a pocket south of Kharkov was scheduled to commence on 17th May, but the Russians broke out on the 12th and headed north. Bock was sufficiently alarmed to solicit permission from Hitler to pull back, but Hitler refused and ordered up Kleist's army group from the south. The encirclement succeeded on 22nd May at Izium. Plunder and innumerable prisoners were netted. While this was going on, Manstein had set off to capture Sevastopol. An artillery barrage on 13th June was followed by the first attack on the 7th, but Sevastopol held out until the beginning of July. Hitler considered the conquest of the whole Crimea as a great victory for the German forces and the basis for future successes this year. In the last week of May, I flew to Sicily and North Africa to see Kesselring and Rommel, respectively. On the outward flight, I went to Deurne, where Kesselring had an outpost of his HQ. He received me very warmly, and I remained his guest for 2 days. We discussed Rommel's intention to take Tobruk and then push on for Egypt. Kesselring and Rommel did not get on. Krul had been earmarked as Rommel's successor by Panzer Army Africa Command Staff, and Kesselring was looking forward eagerly to the change. Kesselring was an optimist and was positive about Rommel's plan, although he did not believe that our forces would stretch all the way to Egypt. Even to take Tobruk, Rommel would need a surprise attack. He was dependent on the Italians for his supplies, and his losses were likely to be high. In the morning of 1st of June, we were horrified to learn that the British had taken Krul prisoner. Kesselring's hopes for an early change in command had evaporated. I was surprised at how philosophically he took it. We set out in 2 Fieseler stalks to meet Rommel about 30 kilometres southwest of Tobruk. His camp looked like a disorganised mess in the middle of the desert. Kesselring discussed with him what he needed in the way of air support. Rommel said that everything depended on successful operations in the next few days if Tobruk were to be taken. That afternoon we flew back to Deurne. On my return to Wolfschanze, I found a very unpleasant atmosphere. On 27th of May, an attempt had been made on the life of Heydrich in Prague. He died of his injuries a week later. On the night of 30th of May, the RAF had attacked Cologne with 1,000 bombers. When I reported to Hitler about my North African impressions, he replied by deploring bitterly the attack on Cologne. He complained about the poor flak and said that from the beginning the Luftwaffe had not given flak the attention it merited. This was the first time I had heard him criticise Goering. Hitler never regained absolute confidence in the Reichsmarschall and complained that he, Hitler, now had to involve himself personally in organising air raid precautions within the Reich. From now on, he frequently mentioned to me that the Luftwaffe command, he meant Milch and Jeschonnek, must pay more attention to defence of the home territory. I inferred from these conversations that Hitler expected no end to the British air raids and saw in them a great danger for the Reich. I discussed this very closely with Jeschonnek. How seriously Hitler viewed the murder of Heydrich, which had been arranged by the Czech government in exile in London, was demonstrated by his presence at the state funeral in Berlin on 9th June. Himmler delivered the obituary. Hitler added a few words. When he greeted the Czech President Hácha, he warned him forcefully against any further terrorist activities against German rule in the Protectorate. If this happened, severe reprisals would have to be taken. During a stay at the Berghof after the burial of Heydrich on 20th June, Hitler visited the Reichswerke at Linz. As usual, he urged them to step up heavy panzer production. In general, I observed that Hitler could judge at a glance a factory's possibilities and know if his demands were capable of being met. From Linz, he went to Munich to attend the funeral of NSKK leader Adolf Hühnlein, a 1923 veteran whom he considered exceptionally able and proven. On the evening of the 26th, we returned to Berlin. On the way, Rommel's report announcing the capture of Tobruk reached Hitler. He was delighted at this success and promoted Rommel to General Feldmarschall at once. He endorsed Rommel's plan to continue the operation to the banks of the Nile, which was contrary to the wishes of the Italians, who wanted to occupy Malta. On 28th of June, an attack codenamed Blau, Blue, began along the front between Taganrog on the Black Sea and Kursk. 2 army groups involving 5 armies took part. Once the Russian front had been parted, the advance proceeded according to plan in the direction of Voronezh, which was surrendered by the Soviets on 6th of July. Following the River Don, units of the 6th Army continued the advance towards the southeast. A sharp controversy now arose involving Hitler, Halder and Bock. At the beginning of the operation, Hitler had made it perfectly clear that the advance of the panzer divisions was to be pursued without pause, in order that retreating Russian units should be overrun and crushed, and the Volga reached as soon as possible. There had been a 48-hour rest at Voronezh. Hitler had censured this severely and was so infuriated that he relieved Bock and replaced him with von Weichs. He added to this directive the observation that he would not allow the generals to jeopardize his plans as they had done in the autumn of 1941. German troops advanced very smartly along the whole front, but found that the Russians had vanished. The tally of prisoners was relatively light, and led to the conclusion being drawn that the Russians either had withdrawn knowing details of the attack in advance, or were too short on the ground to resist effectively. This was debated endlessly at FHQ. Hitler emphasized that the Russians were at their end and urged his units to hasten. Unfortunately, after initial successes, a shortage of fuel obliged the motorized units to wait several days for supplies to arrive. On the 16th of July, FHQ was transferred forward to Werwolf, near Veneza. Hitler did not feel well here. He found the heat oppressive, and the place was plagued by flies and mosquitoes. During these weeks, I spent as much time as I could in the air, keeping in touch with the HQs of Göring and Jesionek to the rear. At mealtimes, Hitler was very open to conversation and talked at length with Admiral Theodor Kranke, Radar's representative. The usual wide range of subjects was discussed. A particular talking point was the mysterious British landings at Dieppe on 19th August. I have never been clear what the purpose of this operation was. Enemy commandos came ashore on heavily fortified beaches, and after suffering heavy casualties left 12 hours later. Hitler and Kranke examined the affair from all angles, but neither could come up with a satisfactory explanation. Hitler was extremely indignant for several days following an unofficial Gebirgsjäger operation on 21st August, when the highest peak of the Caucasus, the 5,600-metre-high Elbrus, was scaled in order to place the German war flag on the summit. Although undoubtedly a great mountaineering feat, it served no military purpose, and such events were expressly forbidden. Hitler's permission had not been sought beforehand, and he learned of the feat in a cinema newsreel preview. Every effort was made to track down the culprits, but they were never identified. Hitler was soon forced to address more serious problems. On 23rd August, advance units of General Paulus's 6th Army reached the Volga. This good report was overshadowed by news confirming that, as expected, the Russians had recovered some lost territory from Army Group North. The 11th Army had been moved up from South Russia to lend weight to the effort to capture Leningrad in Operation Nordlicht, but now Manstein had to be diverted to help beat off the Soviets in the energy-sapping Battle of the Ladoga Sea. It succeeded, but the last chance to take Leningrad had gone. When List, C&C Army Group A, Caucasus, reported to Hitler on 30th August, it was clear that he was close to the end of his strength. Everywhere in that vast expanse he was running up against stiff resistance. Hitler was influenced by the calm manner in which List presented his report, and showed understanding for the situation of the army group, but insisted that the set objectives had to be kept. Hitler was still thinking of a thrust to Astrakhan and the shores of the Caspian Sea. Around this time I made a longish visit to the front at Stalingrad. I went first to the 71st Infantry Division south of the city and advancing towards the Volga. My brother was Chief of Staff of this division. He was confident and gave me a comprehensive impression of the situation. It appeared that recently the Russians seemed stronger, but he had no concerns about it. What worried him was the question of supply. Ammunition and fuel were needed urgently. My next call was to the 6th Army General Staff. I knew several staff officers well, and was announced to General Lieutenant Schmidt. I gained a positive impression of matters despite the shortages and other worries, which included the long supply line behind the Axis armies on the Don. Covering the rear were Romanian, Italian and Hungarian armies, one of each, which in his opinion did not amount to satisfactory protection. Schmidt said that the Russians' presence was growing in size daily, and that they were occupying an area which was difficult to observe. I found this very unsettling. I could speak openly with Schmidt, and he was frank with me. After a brief call on General Paulus, I flew to meet General Hube, commander of Taftorbith Panzer Corps, as successor to Wittersheim, whom Hitler had just relieved of command. On my return, I found Veneza plunged in gloom. Hitler had withdrawn into seclusion. The situation conferences were no longer being held in the Wehrmacht Command Staff House, but in the large study at Hitler's quarters. When one entered, he would not offer his hand, but acknowledged the caller's presence by merely extending his arm. He dined alone in his bunker. 2 female Reichstag stenographers took down all his conferences, including the situation conferences, verbatim. We military adjutants had then to check the resultant type scripts for accuracy, a considerable undertaking. And what was responsible for all this? After List's visit, Jodl had flown to Army Group A to size up the situation and talk over the next move. When he delivered his report to Hitler subsequently, a violent argument had erupted. Hitler had told Jodl that he had not sent him to the Caucasus to obtain an account of their misgivings. Equally vehemently, Jodl had shouted back that nothing else could be expected from the bringer of impossible orders. At that, Hitler had left the conference room and had not returned since. The only person he had spoken to was Schmundt, in order to discuss with him the coming reshuffle. Hitler had got rid of List and announced his intention to dismiss Halder. Schmundt advised him strongly to appoint General Zeitzler as Halder's successor. Hitler decided to think about the changes for a few days. I waited until the waters had calmed before reporting on my trip to Stalingrad. Hitler was much calmer and gave me his usual welcome. To my surprise, I found that he shared Schmidt's reservations about the Don area. He said that he had put the 22nd Panzer Division in reserve behind the front as a precaution, but had the impression that Halder did not see any danger there. That did not coincide with his own appreciation. He would speak to him about it. Then, angering swiftly, he complained of the little understanding which Halder had for the difficulties. Halder could see a situation developing on a map, but had no ideas for solving it. He was dispassionate and dry and held quite false notions of how the campaign should proceed. Therefore, Hitler was determined to make the change. He added that the mass of older generals were past their best and must be replaced by younger officers. Schmundt would take over the Army Personnel Bureau, where he would arrange matters. Personally, I thought that these were enormous changes which were bound to transform the army substantially, but I said nothing. Basically, I was happy that Halder was going. In my opinion, his departure was long overdue. Whereas he may well have been a good general staff officer, he was never the right partner for Hitler as army leader. I always had the impression that the army general staff, with Halder as its head, were not well disposed towards Hitler's plans and intentions, and pursued instead quite different objectives. Despite the general air of upset at FHQ, I had a very pleasant 35th birthday celebration on 20th of September. Hitler presented me with a kilo tin of caviar, which Antonescu had given him. I took this generous gift as the incentive to invite both adjutanten to a small party. This was in fact the only occasion when we all got together, the stenographers Fräulein Wolf and Fräulein Schröder, Schaub, Albert Bormann, Puttkamer, Engel, Schulze-Kossens, Brandt and Hewell. Unfortunately, Schmundt was absent from FHQ that day. After the evening situation conference, we finished off the caviar and conversed openly about our concerns. A confidence existed amongst us that we could speak freely without the fear of unpleasant consequences. I noticed that we were all capable of making independent judgments. On 24th of September, Hitler dismissed Halder. Zeitzler was made chief of the general staff in the rank of General der Infantry. He set about his new task with verve and commitment. He had got himself a difficult C&C, but Hitler had great confidence in him and more or less left him to his own devices. This would show through more clearly in a few weeks as the situation worsened at Stalingrad. As promised, Hitler gave Schmundt the Army Personnel Bureau. His predecessor, Keitel's brother, had not been equal to the task for some time. Schmundt had not been particularly anxious to take on the office, since he had quite enough to do as it was. Nevertheless, Hitler eventually talked him round. I thought the decision was correct. Schmundt knew better than anybody Hitler's ideas about the army high command, and was also in a position to reflect their thinking. In the year and a half that he ran the office, he often contradicted Hitler and got his own way. Schmundt was a good advocate for the Army Officer Corps. In September, it became obvious that the purpose of the British air raids was to build a second front. The RAF attacked Munich, Bremen, Dusseldorf and Duisburg. As the aircraft crossed into Reich territory, air raid alarms were given for vast areas, sending people down into the shelters for hours at a time. This brought a damaging loss of production, particularly serious for the armaments industry in its train. Quite apart from the damage and casualties inflicted by the bombing itself, these alarms imposed a great strain on people. Hitler spent much time contemplating how he could combat the problem. It had always been his principle to retaliate, like for like or worse, but that was not now possible. The Ju-88 was still not being turned out in satisfactory numbers. The He-177 was a complete disaster. Hitler had had grave doubts about the design from the start and was now confirmed in his opinion. Hopes were focused on the Ju-88, but Milk, who was responsible for aircraft supply, was concentrating on producing fighters to improve air defence. I was amazed that Hitler expressed satisfaction with all this and did not attempt to interfere. He told me that he trusted Göring, who had promised an early improvement in the state of the Luftwaffe. At the end of September, Hitler flew to Berlin to make 3 speeches and keep a number of important appointments. On 28th September, he addressed 1,200 newly commissioned officers, fresh from training school, and made emphatically clear to them their duty. They had to understand that the war with the Soviet Union had increased in bitterness, but he was certain the German soldier would win. On the 29th, he had a long meeting with Rundstedt, recently appointed CNC West. Hitler feared British landings and wanted to discuss defensive strategy. Rundstedt was not pessimistic on this point. What concerned him was the unoccupied part of France. He considered the area to be a reservoir of saboteurs and spies safe from our attentions. Hitler said he would deal with this problem soon. Next day, he spoke at the Sportpalast at the opening of the War Winter Relief Work. I was surprised here at his openness. He said that capitulation was unthinkable. The British had declared that the Second Front had arrived, for which they proposed to step up extensively the bombing war. Hitler described this as insane utopia. His critical listeners could decide on the truth of this for themselves. On 1st October, in a visibly heartfelt reunion, Hitler received Rommel and awarded him his Feldmarshal's baton. During a long conversation, Hitler spoke of his doubts and worries. The inadequate supply of weapons and equipment was an especial headache. He feared that one day the British would arrive with a large, superior force, and then he would have difficulties. Rommel's army was at El Alamein, which he had well fortified. He was still very confident. Hitler asked him about the reported British air superiority. Rommel replied that the situation was not critical. Afterwards, both went into the Chancellery Gardens, where an impressive display of new weapons, including assault guns and a Tiger tank, was on show. Rommel requested them for the front as soon as possible, which Hitler promised to see to. I had the impression that he was beginning to deceive himself. He was underestimating the fighting strength of the Russians and also had the wrong idea about the British. That same day he addressed the Gauleiters. I did not hear this speech, but feared that it would be cast in too optimistic a vein. Over the next few days, he had various talks about armaments before we returned to Vinnese on 4th October. Generaloberst von Richthofen always managed to hit the right note in conversations with Hitler. He spoke frankly and critically and avoided naming guilty parties. He was very worried about the Eastern Front and described situations which the Russians might seize for their own advantage. Hitler's concern coincided with that of Richthofen. They both thought it very possible that the Red Army on the Don would break out from the woodlands on the north bank of the river. Hitler said he would talk this over with Seitzler. Richthofen referred to the latter disparagingly as fat and merry. Hitler often put himself in the shoes of the Russians. He felt he should draft in additional reinforcements to bolster the sector where the non-German Axis armies were concentrated, but his warnings met with little success. The Department for Foreign Friendly Armies East at OKH was not expecting a Russian attack against the 6th Army on the Don, but against Army Group Centre. Hitler was becoming very uneasy at the increasing reports of saboteur commandos behind the German lines in both Russia and France. Their aim was to disrupt the supply organisation. As far he could see, this was a new form of warfare. For this reason, he authorised the Commando Order, instructing German troops to execute summarily all captured commandos. Jodl added a rider to the order that in essence it was to be regarded as a companion to the 1941 Commissar Order. Hitler's fears were justified, for in the northern sector a huge partisan area had come into being. It was commanded by my Russian namesake, General von Below. Hitler often told me wryly that I ought to bring my relations to heel. During the stay at Vinisa, a young lieutenant of the FHQ signals train told me that he had witnessed a terrible massacre nearby. While working on communications equipment, he had come to a gorge, where he discovered an SS troop shooting a large number of men and women. He was very distressed by what he had seen and thought he ought to report it. I spoke to the SS liaison officer, Gruppenführer Wolf, and asked him to investigate and report back. After a few days, he supplied me with a very ambiguous answer and hinted at sabotage in the rearward areas. I was requested to take no further steps in the matter. I was satisfied with the explanation and forgot the incident. I was not aware of similar reports subsequently. On 23rd October, the British attack in North Africa, expected by Rommel, began. Montgomery was the British C-in-C. His force was about twice as strong as Rommel's, and was equipped with a large number of Sherman tanks. Hitler did not consider the situation to be critical because Rommel had so fortified his positions that even a much superior enemy could be held off. Rommel made a hasty return from leave and was horrified by what he found. The Italian units had melted away into the desert. The German line had held, except for some minor penetrations which they had failed to stem. On 2nd October, Montgomery drove forward again, and his tanks broke through the front. Rommel lacked the fuel and ammunition necessary for a mobile engagement of this nature, and on the 3rd, he appealed to Hitler for help, reporting that he had taken heavy losses, and the British had won ground in a successful advance. Hitler replied in a signal that he must remain where he was and not concede a single step. New units would be supplied swiftly. Rommel had already decided to draw back without OKH approval, and Hitler saw from his report of the 3rd of November that he had made an unauthorized retreat. Hitler became irate, but attributed negligence to FHQ command staff. Fortunately, Schmundt was able to placate him sufficiently so that no dire consequences ensued. For a short while, Varlemont fell into disfavour, and a reserve major, the duty officer, suffered a temporary demotion. But Rommel had lost much of the glamour he had attracted in the outward campaign. From now on, he was the commander of an army driven ever westwards across the desert towards Tunisia for a last stand in May 1943. But by then, events elsewhere had reduced this theatre to little more than a sideshow. The fighting at Stalingrad became very fierce in the autumn of 1942. Frequently, reports would come in describing bitter fighting for a block of flats. Hitler insisted that at Stalingrad every house had to be fought for. Only in this way could the Russians be forced out of the city. I believed that we had arrived at the crossroads of events. Hitler often seemed unduly pensive and far away. almost as if he no longer had confidence in the strategy. The extent of the fronts had become enormous, the supply of weapons and munitions problematical. But Hitler made increased demands. Did he truly believe even now that the war could end in a German victory? The question was surfacing for the first time. The answer could not be fathomed. On 1st November, we had had a very pleasant surprise on our return to Wolfschanze. All concrete bunkers had been fitted, with a large wooden barracks annex, which made the place much more habitable. Hitler's barracks had a large study added for the daily situation conferences. On the 6th, whilst we were proceeding by the train to Munich via Berlin, a very disturbing signal was received from the Mediterranean. For days, our agents had been reporting the assembly at Gibraltar of a large troop convoy, and this had now sailed eastwards. Towards Munich, our train was stopped at a station in the Thuringian forest to receive a Foreign Office communiqué that a US Expeditionary Corps was disembarking in Algiers and Oran. Ribbentrop was waiting for our train at Bamberg. He had summoned Ciano to Munich, but wanted to speak to Hitler beforehand. He suggested contacting the Russian embassy in Stockholm to arrange an approach to Stalin proposing far-reaching concessions in the east. Hitler brushed the idea aside. A moment of weakness was not the proper time to negotiate with an enemy. Instead, he issued orders for the American landings in Algeria to be repelled. Jodl was instructed to organise the Wehrmacht for the defence of Tunis. As it happened, Oran lay just beyond the range of our bombers, and so no attacks were possible. On 8th November, Hitler spoke to the party veterans. I had the impression that the Algerian affair had winded him. He spoke only of driving the Americans out, but as he stepped up to the platform to address the auditorium, he appeared to be bursting with confidence. They applauded him and followed his arguments in a state of rapture. Actually, he had nothing new to say. He spoke of the bitter fighting in which our soldiers were embroiled, and said that it was about the right of our people to be or not to be. In the evening of the 10th, he had talks with Ciano and Laval. Neither could influence his decision to occupy Vichy France. And next day, German troops began the invasion, which proceeded swiftly and without a special incident. It took a few days to capture Toulon, and in this time the French scuttled the remnants of their fleet there. Hitler retired to Obersalzberg for a few days' rest on 12th November. After the unsettling stop in Munich, I had the opportunity to speak to him privately for the first time. He was depressed. The Western powers, the USA and Britain, had begun to take an active role. He judged this to be a very serious development. Moreover, there was the difficulty of shipping supplies across the Mediterranean. The British had increased the number of their submarines there. He had no confidence in the Italians. They were pro-British, and he had no doubt that they were reporting the movement of German transports to the British. Another theme that weighed down on him was the Luftwaffe. Goering had also been in Munich, and it struck me then that Hitler and Goering no longer talked together as they had done previously. Hitler said that Goering did not keep himself properly informed, and Hitler preferred to discuss current problems with Jeschonnek for that reason. He spoke to me in forceful tones about the air defence of the Reich. More flak had to be produced, for our fighters were seldom available in sufficient numbers, or they went to the wrong area, or they were hampered by bad weather. We also needed more flak towers, for example in Munich and Nuremberg. In Berlin and Hamburg, these structures had proved themselves in practice. He hoped that there were no new surprises in store on the Eastern Front, although he suspected that there would be a new Russian offensive at the start of winter. He had drawn this conclusion on the basis of the British and American operations in North Africa. On 19th November, Zeitzler called Hitler to inform him that the Red Army had begun a great winter offensive along the Don. After heavy artillery preparation, Russian tanks and motorized infantry had moved south in large numbers and broken through the Romanian lines. The Romanians had broken and run, and the Russians were advancing almost unopposed. Hitler ordered General Heim's Panzer. Corps in reserve to move to intercept. Hitler had been misled as to the quality of this Panzer Corps. Its German division was still in formation, and the other unit was a Romanian tank division, which proved no match for the Russians and was finished off in a few days. Hitler was outraged by Heim's conduct, although really he had been put into a hopeless position through contradictory orders and the enemy's strength. Heim was relieved of command and condemned to death, although Schmundt obtained a reprieve in due course. On 20 November, Hitler ordered Manstein's Army Oberkommando 11, which had been transferred from Army Group North to Army Group Centre at Vitebsk, to be renamed Army Group Don as a new command staff to support the threatened front of Army Group South. Hitler was aware of the critical turn of events, but did not believe that the Russian penetration would have serious consequences. He accepted that the Sixth Army might be encircled for a few days, but considered that he could put that right by a counter-offensive with a few extra reserves. As the developing situation swiftly showed, he was underestimating the Russian forces considerably. The miserable weather of the first 2 days was disastrous. Frost, fog, snow and appalling visibility prevented any aircraft from taking off. A second Russian movement, also south of Stalingrad, which began on 20th of November, confirmed the intention to encircle the city. This they achieved on 23rd November. Seitzler's reports were becoming so alarming that during the late evening of the 22nd, Hitler decided to leave for East Prussia in his train. The journey took 20 hours. Every 3 to 4 hours we made a long stop for a telephone conversation with Seitzler. He was making urgent demands for permission to extricate the Sixth Army before the net closed. Hitler would not allow a single step back. If in the first few days he was thinking that he only needed to mop up the spearhead, now he realized that he was going to need a newly formed army to contain the Russian divisions at Stalingrad. This would require considerable preparation, and for the time being, General Paulus would have to hold his trenches. After we arrived at Wolfschanze, Hitler's initial worry was to supply Sixth Army from the air. He had long conversations with Göring and Jeschonnek about this. Göring assured him that the Luftwaffe could supply the Sixth Army for a certain time. Jeschonnek did not contradict him. Therefore Hitler decided that Paulus could be supplied by air and that he would eventually be in the position to fight his way out of the pocket. As soon as it was reported, Göring's statement was disputed vociferously. Even Seitzler did not believe Göring and told Hitler so forcefully. In the Luftwaffe, Richthofen was very dubious. He considered an airlift out of the question and based this opinion on the weather situation, which was already bad enough and would deteriorate as the winter set in. Moreover, there was a shortage of transport aircraft. Hitler received Richthofen's opinion but rejected it. The distance between Stalingrad and the German lines was growing daily. The Russians had demolished Italian and Hungarian sectors of the front, and there was a 300-kilometre long gap along the Don. Soon after the first Russian breakthrough, Hitler had ordered up Hoth's 4th Panzer Army from Kotelnikov, southeast of Stalingrad, for a counter-attack scheduled for 3rd December, but eventually postponed until the 8th and then the 12th at 15. At the outset, Hoth was quite successful, but when he got to within about 60 kilometres of the ring around Stalingrad, he found himself heavily outnumbered and had to give up. Between 23 and 28 of December, we lost the airfield at Tazinskaya, which was of special importance for supplying our troops within the cauldron. Flights to and from the airfields inside Stalingrad were increased by 100 kilometres, and this reduced dramatically the already inadequate supply situation. In these circumstances, on 27th of December, Seitzler demanded that the Caucasus front be drawn back. Hitler gave his permission, but retracted it shortly afterwards. However, Seitzler had wasted no time in communicating Hitler's first decision by telephone, and he reported to the Führer that the withdrawal could no longer be stopped. I followed the developments at Stalingrad from 19 November to the end of December with a certain dread. My first impression while at Obersalzberg was of a catastrophe. I had paid a short visit to the Don front at the beginning of November, and had obtained reports about the condition of the troops, which held out little prospect of a lasting success there. The basically positive attitude of the officers was tempered by depressing admissions about unit and company numbers. On average, they were having to make do with less than 50% of permitted strengths. Commanders had had to come to terms with this. In the 6 months since June 1942, the German army had fought without replacements and was now exhausted. Even though reinforcements were being pushed forward in December, it seemed unlikely that a strong defence of the Don front would be possible in the face of a determined assault. Thus, the 6th Army at Stalingrad had to stay where it was, for there was no prospect of its achieving a successful breakout to the German lines. From the end of December, I saw its task to be that of tying down the encircling Russian forces for as long as possible to give the Don front time to reform. But the men in Stalingrad were of course doomed. For all his efforts to help the 6th Army, I firmly believe that Manstein thought the same. He knew that, primarily, he had to close the gap along the Don and erect a new, sturdier front. From 1st of December, I received regular correspondence from the Stalingrad cauldron. That day, General Lieutenant Schmidt wrote, "Now we have our ardent all-round defence. I have enough weapons, but little ammunition, little bread. And spirit, no wood for burning or building materials to go below ground and keep warm, and the men, who remain astonishingly confident of victory, are daily losing their strength." On the 8th, his no one orderly officer, Hauptmann Baer, wrote, "Condition of the men is unfortunately shit, living on 200 grams bread ration, and for the most part sleeping in the open, not short of pasteboard, though so morale excellent." And on 26th of December, he said, "Here on the edge of the other event, we think ourselves at the moment a bit betrayed and sold down the river. I would like to tell you quite honestly that there is simply nothing more to eat here. The black bread stocks have run right down. In my experience of the German soldier, it is quite reasonable to expect now that his physical will to resist will become weaker in the cold, and the moment will come when the individual says, 'It's all the shit same to me whether I live or die,' and he simply allows himself to freeze to death, or lets the Russians overrun us." In his letter of 11 January 1943, Baer wrote, "It has become so bad that German soldiers are going over to the other side." 2 days later, he had the unbelievable good luck to be ordered to fly out with the 6th Army War Diary. My brother, who was First General Staff Officer of the 71st Division, and then of the 6th Army, and who had flown back to Stalingrad in early January after recovering from an illness, wrote me on 13th, "It does not look good here. There is no doubt whatever that things are coming to their close." I showed Hitler these letters and read him the pertinent extracts. He made no comment, except to remark on conclusion that the fate of the 6th Army was for us all a profound duty in the struggle for the freedom of our people. In January 1943, I had the impression that Hitler knew that a war against both the Russians and the Americans, a war on two fronts, could no longer be won. Together with Ribbentrop, he considered the idea of driving a wedge between his two major enemies. Ribbentrop's plan was for a peace treaty with the Soviets, but Hitler said that that solution was not yet to be pursued. It remained his intention to mobilize the entire German people, involving every German in the war process. Milk would have to do more to frustrate the British air raids, while he would devote himself day and night to the task of building up his defensive front. With Speer, he discussed armaments projects. Gauleiter Saukel should pool all labour within reach. The result of all this activity was an astonishing upswing in the whole field of armaments production in 1943.